Goodrich with my co-host Brian Kerley, and we are here today to talk to Jayne Rees Buxton, who is an author of fiction, interestingly, and nonfiction books, the latest of which is something I have a particular interest in, a book called The Great Plant-Based Con, which is looking at the pros and cons, I guess is the charitable way to put it, of the vegan/plant-based movement and their attempts to change how we all eat. Welcome, Jayne.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So tell us a little bit about your authoring history and how on earth you got into this particular topic, because this is a little bit out of line with, you know, you're stepping right into the middle of a very unpleasant battle in a lot of ways with both feet. How did that come about?
And I have become acutely aware of that in the recent weeks since the book was published. But how did it come about? Well, as you said in your introduction, I have written other books. I wrote a book of nonfiction way back in 1998, and then I started to work in the field that was connected with that book. I then decided I wanted to write fiction, and I spent a long time doing that. And in fact, I was working on a sort of historical, biographical based novel set in Lithuania just before I decided to write this book. So I've abandoned that. That was...
Okay, a quick aside here. My wife, as it happens, is a very proud Lithuanian, so please don't abandon that book.
Okay, that's interesting.
I'll be interested to hear more about that one offline, as will she.
Yeah.
Are you Lithuanian?
So that was great. It involved me doing a lot of research and going over there, and I was very much into it. It was a problematic novel, so abandoning it had some benefits as well, but I probably will go back to it. But yeah, the reason I put that on hold and embarked on this subject is because about mid-2019, maybe a little bit earlier than that, I started to notice just how loud the plant-based message was getting. It was becoming overwhelmingly loud. It was ubiquitous. Everybody was parroting it. And then, and I started to worry about that. And then the movie, The Game Changers, came out. You'll recall that. And
which, for anybody who hasn't seen it, is essentially a vegan propaganda movie showing that you can be just as healthy on a vegan/plant-based diet as on a or even more healthy, I suppose, than on a omnivorous diet.
That's right. And on the back of that, I noticed and I read about lots of young people, young women, young men who were going to go give veganism a try. And I foresaw a huge health crisis in the young if this were to take off, if it were become embedded in people's ways of eating. And I thought, right, I was doing some research at the time because I was interested in the topic, but I then decided to turn the research into a book. So it was that movie was kind of a tipping point for me in making me decide that this was really worth doing as a project.
Interesting. And how is it going? How has the reception been so far? You mentioned that you've learned a little bit about what a battle you got into, and in talking to each other about this, you had mentioned there's some group that's after you now. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, I mean, they were after me. They've laid off of it now, but yeah, I was warned in the early stages of writing this. Whenever I would tell someone, they would say, "Oh, you know, why are you doing that? Because you're really, really kicking the hornet's nest here, and you're going to there's going to be a lot of comeback." And so I knew that was going to happen. Intellectually, I knew it, but I guess when it actually happens, it's a different thing. And so it has been a little bit difficult to deal with some of the pushback from the really strong vegan pro-plant-based advocacy side. Some of the abuse can get quite vile, which is amazing from a group of people who are supposed to be all about kindness, isn't it?
Yes.
But it's also the constant pushback on facts. And what I found kind of interesting is that that side of the argument, they love to use random facts that sound very impressive on their own, isolated facts. And they can throw those into a debate, whether it's on Twitter or in a book festival, for instance, that I was at, this happened. And it shocks everybody, and everybody goes, oh yes, that's a really interesting fact. That must mean you're right. But they never look at the thing in the round, and sometimes their facts are incorrect or incomplete. And so it's a really difficult thing to combat that. So you have to be really on your toes when you're debating with these people, because they're out to undermine. They're definitely out to undermine. But they are in the minority, I would say.
They're a very small minority, but a very vocal minority.
And they're even in the minority in terms of the feedback I've had from the book. So it's over, I would say, it's 90% positive. The feedback, in social media, in the media. And a small minority are really gunning for me and for the idea. So that's kind of interesting as well. And then they lose a little bit of wind, and then they come back a week later and they have another go.
Right, usually, in my experience, from a different angle. But
yeah, that's right.
Right. So the book is kind of two tracks. One is looking at the dietary claims kind of from an objective, what's the real science point of view, and then the other is looking at their organizational structure. Now, I forget exactly how I came across this, but I recently found a little article about this fellow who had been a medical con man, and he had this machine that would shine colored lights on you, and he claimed it could cure all sorts of different diseases. And he was arrested a number of times, and but managed to make some kind of a living, and had a house that he lived in New Jersey with his family. And but he was a legit medical con man. I mean, that was his profession, was being a medical con man. And interestingly, his son founded the American Vegan Society, which is still run out of the same house that was paid for by this medical con. So when I saw the title of your book, I went, yay, somebody's getting to the core of the matter.
Wow. Yeah. That's so interesting. I didn't know that about the American Vegan Society. I didn't know that.
I just found this out myself probably a month or two ago. Of course, with book publishing, that never would have made it in, even if I had gotten to tell you. But
yeah, that's right.
So tell us first, start off with just what you found about their diet claims and how they try and promote their diet claims. I watched several years ago an interview with, or not an interview, a debate between two of the folks you talk about in your book, Nina Teicholz and David Katz. And and what I noticed was Katz would throw a lot of studies on the screen in rapid succession so that you couldn't see what any of them were, and then claim that they all said whatever he wanted to say, but there was no way to follow what he was actually putting on the screen. Have you talked to us about that process?
That's so typical. That is exactly what happens. And in fact, that's what happened in the Game Changers too. They threw up study after study after study, 5 at a time on the screen, and then they whipped it off, and you could never really see what it was. But then somebody did do an analysis. A few people did an analysis. So Jayne Rees did an analysis of that, which you may have read. And it was a 3-part article. He went through every single study that had been used in the Game Changers. And he showed that not a single one of them served as the evidence for a plants-only diet being better for health. So I think that, if you look at all the evidence, it doesn't add up. It doesn't add up at all. And whether it be the evidence about saturated fat in meat being bad for you, which is usually one of the first places that they start when advocating for plant-based diets. You'll hear people say, well, they're better because they have no saturated fat in them.
Right.
So then you have to get into the whole debate about whether saturated fat is in fact bad for you. So then you go back into the study which of Ansel Keys' work back in the 50s, which was, he was the originator of the idea that saturated fat would cause heart disease. And then I look at, that particular research, and then all the subsequent research, which has disproved that diet heart hypothesis since then.
I think saying it's been disproved is a very fair thing to say.
Yeah, it's very fair to say. And in fact, a very mainstream scientist here, Professor Tim Spector, said almost no serious scientist believes that hypothesis today. So I think that's fair to say. But doesn't mean that most people most lay people don't still believe it. There's a hangover effect, and a lot of people still parrot that fear of saturated fat as a good reason not to eat meat or not to eat cheese or any animal products. So that's one. The saturated fat argument is one cornerstone, I think. The other cornerstone is just a whole range of epidemiology, which purports to show that vegans are healthier, live longer lives, et cetera, et cetera.
A lot of which is produced by the Seventh-day Adventists, who are an objective group of people, right?
Or their offshoots, at Loma Linda University,
yeah.
Their partners at Harvard University, who are pretty thick as thieves with Loma Linda on this stuff.
Now,
yeah,
they're partners. You're calling them partners. That's a pretty.
Well, that's a loose term.
Okay.
In the sense that they support them.
But they also co-publish, so it's fair to use the term partners, I think.
Yeah, they do co-publish some things. And of course, back in the day, there were even tighter links between, say, Frederick Stare and Harding and Harvard University. So there are a whole host of organizations. Also, the Mayo Clinic puts out a lot of this epidemiological research, which purports to show that vegan diets are better for health. When you examine all of those studies, though, and this, I don't have to tell you this.
No, but
yeah,
we're doing this for an audience, so
they are invariably extremely weak, with hazard ratios in the region of 1.1, 1.2. And for people who are not used to reading studies, what that means is that the supposed risk of eating, say, an animal food as opposed to a plant food to your health is going to be, it's going to give you a 1.1 times increased risk. Now, these levels of risk, which are generally shown across the board in these studies, have been shown to be nonsensical in the scheme of most research. So
you mentioned in your book,
sorry,
I think you quote in your book, I can't remember who it was.
Dr. David Klurfeld, I bet it was Dr. Klurfeld.
Yeah, perhaps saying that it was saying that in any field outside of nutrition, hazard ratio of less than 2 is considered meaningless. One being, of course, no risk.
Yeah.
And so hazard ratios of less than 2 is where nutritional epidemiology lives most of the time.
It lives all of the time. It lives there all of the time. So not only are the hazard ratios in these studies extremely small, but then you have the usual confounders that go and the usual weaknesses that go with epidemiological nutrition studies. The confounding variables, the inability to infer causation from a mere association, those things we know about epidemiology, we know that to be a weakness. And yet the case is repeatedly built on this work. And in fact, just this week, I was in a debate with somebody who just threw out a whole bunch of these studies as if they were definitive.
Right.
And they aren't. And it's very difficult to argue back against that body of research, because even though it's rubbish research, even though it really doesn't prove what it is alleged to prove, there's a lot of it. There's an awful lot of it, which is why we have this, what's called, really, I call it a con in the sense of a conditioning effect on people's thought processes, but it's also a consensus, right? People think it has formed a consensus that plant-based is better, and they get very angry that someone is challenging that so-called consensus.
Right. Well, which sort of gets us on to the next point. Tell us about who these people are generally, or at least who the core of them are, because there are certainly lots of fellow travelers. But what's the core group who's pushing this message in the scientific communities and the medical communities primarily?
I don't think that there is a core or a single organization or there certainly isn't a single person. I think the power of this movement is in the coordinated messaging by 5 or 6 groups and types of groups. That is where the power is, because they then reinforce each other. Right. And that is what creates this overwhelming consensus where people will say to you, well, everybody says this is true, therefore it must be true. So it's, but
you talk at length about the Adventists.
So the Adventists are at the heart of it, and they do pull strings, but they don't need to pull that many, because they just act in concert with everybody else. But the Adventists, since 1863, when their church was founded, have believed in the Garden of Eden diet, which is essentially a plant-based vegetarian diet. They believe that eating meat,
which is based on
thoughts.
Yeah, which is based on a misreading of Genesis.
Yeah, very likely, yeah. But the more important thing, I think, is what went on to happen after those edicts, which is the influence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church within dietetics. First of all, within Kellogg's itself. So he was the original plant-based Adventist commercial operator who wanted to develop foods that would not cause lustful thoughts in men, that would not cause sin. You then have the proteges of Kellogg, so people like Leonard Cooper, who went on to have influence over dietitians and the dietitians' textbooks, which were used in the 30s and 40s in America. And then that influence translates all the way through to the dietary guidelines committees operating in the 80s, 90s, and still today, because there's quite a heavy influence of Seventh-day Adventists within these guidelines committees, as has been discussed at length by Nina Teicholz. So if anyone thinks that this funny little church that they might not have heard of, that doesn't exist in their town, and particularly in the UK, for instance, there's not a huge presence. If anyone thinks they don't have influence, what they need to think about is how that influence is wielded very subtly. So 2019.
I've discussed with dietitians who aren't aware that their profession was founded by the Adventist Church, by Leonard Cooper, as you mentioned, who was a protege of Kellogg. So even, every time you see a nutritionist, you are seeing even if it's in, you're seeing somebody who is repeating the message of the Adventist Church, even if they're not aware of it.
That's right. That's right. They don't even know. And that's even more scary when you don't know where the edict comes from, as it were. But it also has a very concrete manifestation in the sense of 2019. You might remember there was a study called, I can't remember the name of it actually, but it was extremely influential, by Marco Springmann and colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
And it purported to show that all plant foods were more beneficial for the environment and for health than all animal foods. And this was one of two studies. There's another one by Joseph Poor, which is often used as well. This study was held up as if it was definitive. It was reported in The Economist. And it really had a lot of legs for a while. And people use it today. It is regularly cited 3, 4, 5 times in policy papers that are written here by our government and by organizations associated with the government. Now, that paper was authored, the lead author, Margot Springmann, is a vegan, but it was also peer-reviewed by a leading professor at Loma Linda University called Juan Sabate. And Juan Sabate also happens to chair the 2020 Guidelines Committee in America, right? So you get that nice link between the vegan ideas and the vegan analysis, which is obviously slanted to favor that argument, and nicely wrapped up and given endorsement by somebody who represents the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And nobody picks up on this. The Economist didn't do due diligence.
Yes. And I mean, he wrote a paper tooting the horn of how successful the Adventist Church has been in spreading their dietary ideas. I mean, he's been represented by the Adventist Church as a medical missionary.
Yeah, he's a big cheese.
Sabate.
Yeah. So this is insidious, isn't it? It's very subtle. Most people won't pick up on it if they weren't aware of Loma Linda University. But my guess is that university and Sabate himself just gave that paper a free pass. There's no peer review going on there. It was just, oh wow, this supports our point of view, so let's give it a go. Yeah. And that is how this stuff becomes embedded in what is called scientific theory and scientific consensus, which is dangerous.
Right. Yeah. It's literally just an echo chamber. I mean, in going through the literature, they're very effective at, particularly in the area that I'm interested in, the health effects of seed oils. Whenever a negative piece of evidence comes out, they immediately turn around, generally funded by one of the big seed oil producing companies like Unilever, who you mention repeatedly in your book, and say, oh, no, nothing to worry about. And then, they kind of recycle the same nonsense just so that the most recent paper is always their paper pushing their view. Yeah.
So, of course, this is interesting. And what you just mentioned, Unilever is just one of many processed food companies who are the other sort of arm of this advocacy movement, as it were, because clearly these processed food companies have a great deal to gain from a plant-based future. First of all, most of what they produce now is plant-based anyway, but now they've got a whole new marketing angle on it. Green stickers and planet healthy stickers and heart healthy stickers and vegan. It's just like a boon to them. It's just a market expansion opportunity. That's all it is. And so they will do anything to market these products. Now, they're pretty simple beings, big organizations. In my pre-writing life, I used to be a management consultant, and we would be advising companies on how to grow their profits and grow their markets. And those are the two goals, growth in markets and growth in profits.
Right.
So anything that is going to help that to happen is just going to be something that the whole company is going to get behind. And then, of course, they're so expert at corralling the evidence, the so-called evidence. And they have been gifted this argument that plant-based is better for the planet and it's better for your heart because of the heart healthy, polyunsaturated aspect of their foods. it's just, in a way, you can't blame them for using these arguments. But what is interesting, just this past month, there has been a real pushback about these claims. So two companies in Europe, so there's been a big milk producer, Oatly, and a big retailer of plant-based foods, you'll know them, Tesco, have been slapped on the wrist for making false claims about the benefits of their products for the environment. And in the US, we have this lawsuit. Good. We have this lawsuit in the US taking place because one of the big plant-based meat companies has been accused of overselling its protein content and the benefits and the completeness of its protein. So I am cheered by that. I'm cheered by the fact that good old-fashioned advertising standards authorities, for instance, who are the people that slap Tesco on the wrist, are actually holding them to account for these claims. And we need to do more of that. And governments need to be regulating more closely, because otherwise they'll just run away with this message.
Well, but we also, unfortunately, government regulations are a core part of the problem here. I mean, the dietary guidelines were not pushed by corporations. In fact, they were, and if it wasn't for the meat industry, we would have been at the vegan future back in the 1980s, because they were the only ones who pushed back against trying to eliminate meat in the dietary guidelines in the United States in the first pass. Mm-hmm. So there's definitely a lot of capture. I mean, Nina Teicholz has talked about how it was an Adventist who wrote the first draft of the dietary guidelines in the United States.
Yeah.
So I think the regulators are quite happy to be captured, let's put it that way, because they know that at some point they'll leave government and go work for one of these big companies, which happens all the time.
And also, the terrible thing is that the plant-based idea, message, movement is highly beneficial to governments as well, because it implies economic expansion rather than contraction. So what I mean by that is any other solution to the climate crisis, which is proposed, would attack fossil fuel use, would attack activities like flying, driving, use of energy, consumerism. So the consistent message would be buy less, fly less, drive less, right? Well, that's a really terrible message for economies and for governments of those economies.
Right. Politicians like to be promised more, not less.
Yeah, exactly. So instead, we have this wonderful solution, which is eat less meat and eat more plant-based foods. Hallelujah. That's just an exchange of one market for another. Economic growth continues. Everybody's happy, right? It's just a pipe dream, though. It's a pipe dream. And one of the quotes, which and I know I'm dashing between health and environment, but I do think the things are so interconnected and we need to talk about them together. One of the quotes which really brought that home to me, that attacking meat eating was just like rearranging the deck chairs as a solution to climate change, was Professor Miles Allen, who has served on the IPCC's committee for 1.5 degrees. He's an esteemed scientist here at University of Oxford. And he has said that eliminating methane from livestock would have an absolutely minimal effect on global temperatures. But if we fail to address the global warming caused by fossil fuel use, everything else is pretty much irrelevant. And he actually used those words. In fact, it's right in front of me, pretty much irrelevant. Right. So this is a message that is so clear. And yet, when did you hear that? When do you ever hear that in the press, in public policy declarations or documents?
Well, as you say, they have these wonderful little facts and quote unquote facts. And one of them is that meat is a primary cause of global warming. And Frank Midloner, who you discuss, we've got this recurrent has gone through and debunked that. And, you know, but we have this recurrent pattern of they make these claims, which are often outrageous and have a tenuous relationship to the truth. And then somebody like you has to go write a book.
Yeah. And then people attack it and say there's no data in it.
Yes.
Which has been one of the charges, because they don't like the data. So what they really mean is, I disagree with your data, but instead they say there isn't any. But, you know, the only thing we can do is to keep putting out the alternate data, the data that nobody sees. And of course, I'm not a scientist. I didn't invent this data. I just pulled it from people like Frank, people like Oxford University, Miles Allen, people like you, because I know you helped me a lot with the vegetable oil chapter, you remember?
Yeah, you did a great job on that, by the way.
Well, I could only do a little tiny bit of what was necessary, what you would do, because it's part of a very big argument. But anyway, what I was trying to do was to pull the expertise from people in all these different fields who are so relevant to the argument, and combine it in a way that a layperson has access to that and can understand how it all fits together. And, I hope other people write books like this. I hope there are many more books like this coming forward, and I'm sure there are, because we need to flood the market with these. We need everybody to read this stuff and to know that the facts, as they've been portrayed, are not correct.
Hearts and minds.
Yeah.
I have a question, important question. What do we have on the opposite side, on an institutional level, to match and counter what you had discussed, what you had outlaid earlier in terms of, all the relationships of, regulation setting and guideline setting, and so what do we currently have, or what can we build?
That's a really good question. I think, and actually, Tucker, you might also have an answer to this, which is maybe better than mine.
I think it's a really good question too. I'm eager to hear your response.
Well,
that's a tough
I think
question.
we have a whole host of disparate scientific minds doing excellent work, whether it be in nutrition, whether it be in looking at emissions and the way methane is accounted for, whether it's what Frank does in terms of setting the facts straight, but he's also working towards reducing methane from the dairy industry, for instance, in California. So we have all these disparate scientists who are upstanding, and they're not paid for, even if they have affiliations with agriculture. They are not what I would call paid for minds. And I think that they keep writing, and we just need to put them to the forefront. But in terms of organizations, of the strength and uniformity of the other side, I don't think we have any. But that's a kind of a depressing way of looking at it, isn't it?
Yeah, well, Tucker and I have discussed and are working on the starting of a project we're calling Omega Initiative. Clever name, referring to like polyunsaturated fat.
Yeah.
But it strikes me that we need similar nonprofit, neutral organizations that can bring people together to discuss soil health and the health of eating ruminant meats and all these things, like something that people can join, something that people can contribute to, organizations that can raise money and can find what studies need to be done. And these organizations are important because that's how you become hard to ignore. I mean, like you said about you hope a lot of people write similar books. I started an account making humor about seed oils, and I said I hope 1,000 seed oil disrespecters bloom, right? Because it's those kind of trends that are important in terms of people talking about these things. And but that's the hearts and minds level, right? We have tremendous pressure from the bottom, pushing up into the institutions. Like, Tucker can tell you about cardiologists that eat a carnivore diet, right? But does that mean they're going to
Mm.
get a speech at the American College of Cardiology? I don't know. It's tough.
Which for a long time was run by a vegan.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think part of the answer to that is to remember, as Professor or Doctor, I guess it is, Clearfeld
Yeah.
talks about, is that even in the committee he was in, which came out with a very anti-meat, unscientifically anti-meat message, a majority of the people on that committee were not, well, I guess a majority voted in it, but a majority were not vegetarians or vegans. I think there was, and probably,
well, it was certainly half and half. I think it was about half and half, wasn't it? The way he described it, or maybe you're right.
But if you look at physicians, for instance, a majority of physicians are certainly not vegan or vegetarian. But the other side has been very effective at, the baseball term is you brush somebody back when they're getting too close to hitting a home run. You throw the ball right past their nose and scare them away from the plate so they can't get a good swing in, right? And I mean, that's exactly what they've done repeatedly. You talk about the Noakes trial. The Noakes trial was initiated by a South African dietitian who objected to Noakes promoting animal foods for a human child, which is mainstream medicine. And nevertheless, it caused a trial. Well, every other physician who isn't as stubborn and as much of a maverick, God bless him, as Tim Noakes is going to step back and say, okay, I don't want this to happen to me. I can't afford a 2-year trial, right? And it's tough. And part of what, the Katz's group is the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, which, as you point out, is overwhelmingly non-physicians. But
PCH, that's oh gosh, that's not Katz, that's the other guy. Again, name escaped me, but Katz is THI and he's PCRM. Right.
Yes, that's right, my mistake. But all you see on, when the group gets mentioned in the media is PCRM 170,000 members, and you think, wow, that must be every doctor on earth. But it's a tiny minority, and I think they've done a really great job. And the Adventists, who, as you point out, are the number 2 operators of hospitals in the world after the Catholic Church, God bless them for that, have done a wonderful job at organizing and promoting their message. And the other side is just kind of standing there, wondering what's going on.
So I
say that as being on the other side.
This is, I have noticed again, since the book came out, that people are afraid of that 2%. They have us under their thumbs. The first experience I had of that was I was invited onto our national radio radio show here in the UK, Radio 4, and I was invited on to talk about the book, which is kind of amazing, fair-minded. Okay, great. But they were so frightened of offending their vegan listeners, who could not even be 2% of their listener group, right? That they forgot, and so they challenged a lot of the points that I was making and would not let me say certain things. They
told you this ahead of time?
We had 3 pre-interviews. We went through the questions. We went through what I was going to answer. It wasn't prescribed, but it was advised. And I also knew they were going to edit it, which they did. So they wanted control over that because they did not want to offend vegan listeners, even though they would represent 1, maybe 2% of their listener group. I would say less. So what are they doing? Why are they so happy to offend or to fail to give a voice to the 98%? This is a question that public-facing broadcasters and podcasters and journalists need to ask themselves. Why is that right?
Well, the 98% won't try and get him fired. It's the short answer.
And this is also the same reason why I believe Waterstones has not stocked my book on their front shelves or in
Okay,
the
so
front tables.
Waterstones
Yeah.
is a big book chain in the
Big
UK, I
retailer,
gather.
big book chain here, physical book stores.
Yeah.
And my book is not in the window and it's not on the table. Now, the reason for that, I believe, is they're afraid that if a vegan activist sees that book, they'll throw something at the window or they'll go in and make a fuss, because this is what happens. So the fear of physical retribution is also part of this fear of the 2%. And this is why they have, and I've also noticed that they are allowed to behave in ways that we as individuals are not. So my book went through a year of legal review. That's why it took so long, Tucker, after I interviewed you to get it, out, because it spent a year with the lawyers.
And this was not you hiring lawyers, it was your publisher hiring lawyers.
Hired the lawyers. And we went through every line to make sure that it was not libelous, that it was not incorrect, that it did not say anything untrue or unfair. Now,
Standard which the vegans don't hold themselves to.
Well, no. So the minute it comes out, the reviews on Amazon from those people who obviously dislike the book are telling absolute lies about me. They are stating with certainty that I work for the meat industry, with certainty. Okay, as if they have evidence for this. They are slandering, my credentials. They're talking about how there are lies in the book and there's no data in the book. Now, they're allowed to get away with this. They're allowed to tell lies where we, as people on the other side who are trying to put a reasonable case, are not allowed to do that. So there's this real pandering to this community. There's an unfair deference to the community. It's doing us damage. It's doing the debate damage.
Yeah, well, it's
the answer is. I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, it's a real problem in a debate, and it's why, as a general principle, which I got conned into violating recently, you don't debate somebody who's a dishonest debater, because you spend your entire time rebutting BS rather than trying to make your point. I saw this happen to Nina with cats, and I experienced it myself recently, where, it's just really hard to debate against somebody who's misrepresenting the facts continuously. And it makes you look small when you're pointing out that they're doing it, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I had that experience the first week after the book came out. I went to a book festival. It was me presenting about my book and then a vegan author presenting about his. Only I made the mistake of allowing myself to go first. So I did my presentation. He did not do a presentation. He just attacked mine. He wrote notes as I spoke and then got up and attacked everything and threw out, as you say, random facts. Now, the audience, I could see them. They were completely befuddled by these facts. They weren't sure what they were supposed to be making of them, because they weren't sort of in any consistent argument, any overall comprehensible argument. But if you throw enough of them out, people,
it sounds convincing.
It sounds very convincing.
Well, surely he wouldn't say all these things if they weren't true.
In fact, some of them were true. So, for instance, a big one that they love to throw out is, oh my God, most of they say a large percentage of the grains that we grow are fed to animals. And he said something about 50% of the soy, which is incorrect. That is completely incorrect. It is much, much less than that, and even less for cattle. It's mostly fed to pigs and chickens. But even if he'd been correct, simply throwing that number out of context without an understanding of what kind of protein leverage that gives us, what kind of food quality that creates, is wrong. Because in fact, you could say, so what? So what if half of our wheat goes to feed animals? You could say that, because you could say wheat is not a very nutritious food, but when it's fed to animals, we get a nutritious food out of it. So there are ways that we need to look at this data in a more complex way. And unfortunately, the way the facts are used doesn't really allow that very often.
Right, right. But you say 90% of the feedback that you've been getting has been good.
It has.
Are most of the folks you're interviewing with, and I know you said you've been pretty busy, which is awesome to hear. What is most of the feedback that you're getting? What are the interviewers? How are people who've read your book reacting to it?
They're very pleased that somebody at last is speaking out in a kind of plain way, frank way. They're farmers in particular. My phone rings off the hook with farmers asking me to be on podcasts or to go and speak at an event or to, to talk to a small group of farmers, because they have been on the hard end of this debate, because they're the ones that are getting battered for the food that they provide us. And I think they have been cowed into not really defending themselves all the time. So they just keep quiet. And so I think for them, it's a real joy to have somebody who's saying, no, that's not what the facts are saying. And you should be proud of what you're doing. And what you're doing is not the cause of global warming, by the way. So those people are very happy. Parents come up to me a lot. So at the book festival, it was really interesting. The queue of people lining up to buy my books were older people, parents of teenagers by the looks of it and by what they said to me, and doctors, psychiatrists, people working with young people. And then right next to me in the queue for the vegan book were all the young women. So
who all the physicians are worried about.
Who they're all worried about. And they all queued up to have their picture taken with this sort of Jesus-like figure next to me. And he's obviously an Instagram sensation for his views. So, and in fact, if I had to say one singular purpose that I have in writing this book is to help prevent thousands and thousands of children and young people, and young women in particular, from going down a dietary route that will harm their health.
Yeah.
That would be my number one goal.
Yeah, and it's great that you go through some of the cases where parents have produced rather horrific outcomes in their children by feeding them. Yeah. Granted, some rather ridiculous vegan diets. I mean, it is, conceivable. My background is I've long been involved with this whole argument. I had a girlfriend back in my early 20s who was a vegan, heaven help me, who I'm actually still in touch with.
Right.
But then I shared an office with a Jayne for 2.5 years. And for people who don't know, the Jaynes are the oldest vegetarian community on earth. They've been at it for, I think, almost 5,000 years. And it was really fascinating because, in contrast to my then girlfriend, who touted all the health benefits of a vegan diet, my Jayne colleague explained all the problems. And he was well aware of them. And he said, we've been at this for thousands of years. We know what the issues are. We view it as a sacrifice that we are making. And we believe, in this idea of ahimsa, do no harm. And he explained, I was really impressed because he actually knew all the things that I had been arguing with my girlfriend about, the negatives of the diet. And it's certainly possible to be healthy, as the Jaynes have shown, on a vegetarian diet, but it's important to note they consume milk. They can't do it without dairy. And that was one of the points that he made. So it's just, and so one of the things you do a wonderful job of is talking about these parents who kill, in some cases, their children by, I think there was one where they were giving the baby apple juice and soy milk or something ridiculous. And, it's appalling that people do that to their children. And it's important to get that out when they say, it's a healthy diet. And you have a wonderful section where you go through point by point saying they claim it's a healthy diet for all stages of life, but on its own, unsupplemented, it is unsuitable for human consumption. And I think that's something that they rarely admit outright. If you drill through their websites, and I've done this on the UK Vegan Society, you can find pages where they say, well, you have to supplement with B12. But a famous, my wife was a Grieger vegan at one point.
Was she?
And was quite sick, no shock. And Dr. Grieger says that there's no need to supplement with B12, that we used to get B12 from water, and, and it's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's
incredible. It is ridiculous. And, you mentioned the milk thing, and for children, this is particularly important. I was asked to comment on the fact yesterday that Nestle is developing a new plant milk, a vegan milk for toddlers, especially for toddlers. I can see you shaking your head, Brian. Yeah. And what did I think of this? And so I looked at the press release for this milk. And first of all, the thing that strikes you is that the press release says that this milk is providing the added nutrients that all children need. So they're admitting there are no nutrients in their plant milk itself, but they're adding a bunch of B12, vitamin C, calcium, vitamin A, iodine, zinc, iron. So really we need to be very clear that what is being given to this child in this milk is like a multivitamin pill. That's what it is. That's all it is. And that will have the same downsides as any multivitamin pill in terms of absorbability by the body, interaction, which is different outside the food matrix, all of those things, limitations. But the bigger question I had about that was, at what point, so Nestle's spokesperson said, we're just responding to this huge demand for vegan baby foods. So at what point does responding to a huge demand for vegan baby foods become a complicity in promoting the idea that vegan foods for babies are okay? Right? It's a very subtle shift, but they are actually, by providing these products, they are promoting the idea that this is safe. And yet, most of the European bodies who advise on diets for children say that vegan diets for young children are not safe. So this is where I think, you asked earlier, who might fight back against this? We need these bodies to speak up loudly now about things like Nestle's vegan milk.
And the European medical communities have been much better about it in fairness than the American ones have, as you mentioned in the book, that a number of them, in contrast to the American bodies, have come out and said that it is not suitable for young children and can, lead to health risks. I mean, it's one of the few areas in human nutrition where we do actually have RCTs showing that a plant-based diet is inferior to a diet with milk or best meat.
Unfortunately, as activists, they will work. I'm sure they will work at great effort to make sure that those are minimized, because if you admit that it is unsuitable for children, the next logical step is that it's unsuitable at other stages in life. So that's why on as much as we can to repeat ourselves with the hearts and minds, but then also on an institutional level, figure out how we can organize, how can we become activists? What do we do? And earlier you were talking about the small group of people, 2% as an example given. Part of what gives them strength is the directionality. They're working to change something. So there's a lot of potential energy when you have great directionality in something. So I think that we need to work on our narrative of not just being, just being the status quo of going to the grocery store and buying our meat, but how we want products that are grass-fed, how we want products that are treating animals better, how we want
Yeah.
seed oil-free food options.
Everybody could hear you except for me, so please.
Sure thing. So Jayne was speaking earlier about how it's a relatively small group of people that has outsized influence. And I think part of that reason is the directionality of their views. If their views were taken to fruition, it would have a enormous change in the landscape, the markets and what people eat and everything. And that kind of directionality has tremendous potential energy. So we need to learn from that and craft our own narratives in terms of what we want. And we're not just status quo. We're not just, we want to go and buy the meat at the restaurant or at the store, but we want quality beef. We want grass-fed beef. We want regenerative agriculture practices. We want products that are seed oil free. There's a lot to what is considered what is more mainstream in terms of what we eat and what we consume, what we purchase, that can be aspirational. And I think that if you can inform the average person that they can with their dollars, and this is also we would have to create more markets and encourage more farmers and more companies to address these. But if your average person can become more aspirational, it would be more attractive. And as an aside too, and there are cultural shifts over time. The vegetarian and vegan side of things is corporate now. It is more punk rock to be someone who supports regenerative agriculture, to be someone that does not support seed oils. And you will start to see those kind of cultural changes over time. These kind of shifts are interesting and people are noticing. I can give a one quick story. A few years ago, about 5-6 years ago, I was at a wedding, and let's see, I was about in my mid-30s at the time, and I ran into a guy I've known since high school, and he was vegan since high school. And he came up to me and said, "You're in medical school, right?" This is years ago. I've done residency now. He said, "Do you think I need to get B12 shots or something?" And it just totally caught me off guard. I was like, what's this? And he's like, "Yeah, I've been vegan now for over 20 years or something." And I was like, yes, you probably do need some B12. And it was interesting because it just came out of nowhere. It was a little self-deprecating. It was humble, where he was saying, I know there's probably some things I'm lacking. And we had a quick conversation about buying better, or buying, well-sourced, buying meat from good farms and regenerative agriculture. And we just had a quick talk at the table. He said, I have thought about that, but I figured if I did it, I would just, go full bore and just become a full meat eater. Right. So he recognized that 5 or 6 years ago. So, the word is out there, and I think it's done nothing but grow. So, but we do need to work on our narrative in mind, and also, on the institutional level, because it's the institutional level that's going to set the guidelines, and it's going to enact things like meatless Mondays, in school districts and those types of things. So there's multiple levels to this that we need to address.
Multiple levels is a good way to put it, because it's like a multiple level marketing scheme, like a Ponzi scheme, because what they're doing, and Jayne does a really good job of detailing this, is middle-aged people know friends who are vegans or have tried it themselves and realize that it doesn't work all that well. So they go to the schools and they con kids into thinking that it's the thing to do. And, they're the ones who are very susceptible to this sort of message, right? And I mean, the comment about Nestle saying, "Oh, there's a big market out there for vegan milk." Well, they all thought that there was a big market out there for vegan meat, and that market is in the middle of imploding. I mean, with, to your title, The Plant-Based Con, it turns out that Impossible, was it Beyond Meat or whichever one was sued, which you mentioned before?
Yeah, it was Beyond, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, Beyond is running a con. They are fraudulently misrepresenting, in violation of the law, the protein content of their false meat, right?
Yeah.
That's the allegation in the lawsuit. And I went through the lawsuit, I went through the claims and went through the tests of what the law says. And the claims to me look valid, that they were misrepresenting, they were using the wrong test, right?
Yeah.
To their credit, in this case, the regulators insist that you do a test that takes into account the inferior quality of plant proteins.
Bingo.
And
yeah.
therefore, they didn't use it. They
Yeah.
used an inferior test that didn't take the digestibility of plant proteins into effect. So that is literally a con, assuming that
Yeah.
all these claims come true. We'll give them that benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
And I suspect that what Nestle is going to find out is that their big demand is big in volume, but small in number. And as Jayne, having been a marketing or a management consultant, will attest, most business people are mercenaries at the end of the day. And if they will dive into this because they think there's a big market out there.
Yeah.
And you know what a lot of people don't seem to realize, I talked to one fellow on Twitter who wrote an article about how new this whole idea of meat-based, of vegan meats, faux meats is. And I said, no, it's not new. This was one of the things that Kellogg started trying to do
Of course.
in the 1800s. And every time they try it, it fails because nobody wants it.
Yeah. In fact, just this week or a couple of days ago, the Sunday Times here reported that a bunch of vegan restaurants were closing. There's something called Honest Burger, and it is one of several chains to close because of lack of demand.
Yes.
And others have shifted towards serving meat instead, so they've just shifted straight over.
Right.
And it was very interesting. The kind of market analyst who was interviewed for this article said, it turns out that these plant-based meat substitutes require a heck of a lot of processing and a lot of ingredients, and it's very expensive, but customers aren't prepared to pay for that. They don't see the point in paying for it. So it could be that good old home economics, the budgeting powers of individuals managing their own, home budgets, is what stops this particular aspect of the plant-based agenda in its tracks. The meat substitutes, they will be held at that very small level, and then of course that's not going to be good enough because all those venture capitalists who've put their money in the expectation of massive profits need to be satisfied somehow. So that's going to be a big problem.
They're also used to getting burned. I mean, they have a 90% failure rate, so they won't be hugely surprised.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting to look at that, which I think is a possible win for our side, as it were.
Right.
In contrast to the hearts and minds angle, which Brian was talking about earlier. And I think you're right, we need a positive movement. I think it's got to center around the real food message, real and regenerative. And it has to be as new and exciting as the other side's message seems to be. We have a couple of organizations here in the UK which are doing that. There's something called the Real Food Campaign that I work alongside, and something called the Public Health Collaboration. I'm sure you know those, Sam Feltham of the Public Health Collaboration.
Oh, yes, of course. Right.
Yeah. Right. So they push this real food message very heavily. The question then becomes, how do we make that a bigger movement? How do we join these people together? How do we make that a kind of zingy marketing message that appeals to young people in particular? That is the challenge. And it'd be fun to work on something like that.
Yeah, vegans do a very good job of marketing their views, for lack of a better word, and making it look hip, and they get lots of media people. I mean, Lewis Hamilton, the F1 race car driver, has been vegan for several years in a very high profile kind of way. And you never, ever, ever hear about somebody bragging about how they eat grass-fed beef in the same way.
No.
Yeah.
And that's something that,
But what's
is a problem.
interesting is if you got the meat and dairy industry to support a campaign which was very positive in that sense, it might backfire because people would say, well, that's just funded by the meat and dairy industry, obviously. Whereas they never think of the roundabout way that the other message is funded by really plant-based commercial organizations, whether the traditional ones, the Unilevers of the world, or the new ones. People don't think about the fact that James Cameron, who was produced Game Changers, has this $150 million investment in Verdient Foods, which produces pea protein, right? So
Pea protein, which is currently under investigation by the FDA for causing heart failure in pets. And
right.
if you go to the dog food store, I just got a puppy, so I've done this recently.
Right.
All of the quote unquote healthy dog foods list pea protein as one of the major ingredients.
Yeah.
So yes, good work, Mr. Cameron. You're killing our puppies.
Yes.
So much for veganism being kind. But just, on that note, Jayne, if I'm going to criticize your book a bit, I mean, I think it's wonderful so far as it goes. People don't understand when they go see a physician that the physician, and Brian can speak to this, just having left medical school, that physicians residency, sorry. Congratulations, by the way.
I'm practicing.
There you go. Yeah. People don't realize that physicians don't get any training, or very little training, maybe, 16 hours of training. And how many years were you in medical school? Yeah, 4 years, and then another 4 years in residency. So 8 years of training that you might get 16 hours and often none. And then, so what does your doctor do? Your doctor turns around and foists you off on a nutritionist who has been educated by an offshoot of a religious cult, right? And folks need to realize that. I mean, in the United States, this becomes a constitutional issue because it is illegal to establish a religion. And that is essentially what Professor Sabate is doing through our dietary guidelines, is forcing everybody into a religiously motivated diet, which is not going to, which most people don't do very well on. I mean, the Adventists, yes, they're healthier than the average American, which is only because the average American is so unhealthy. But if you compare them to like Mormons who, also don't smoke and don't drink, they're not any healthier. It's not a better diet than, I mean, it's unfair to compare any diet to the average American diet because it may be the worst thing ever invented for human health. I think Brian sent me a study from Darius Mozaffarian, of all people, saying that only, I think, 6% of Americans are healthy from a cardiovascular perspective now, which is just good work, public health. You've gotten us all sick.
Oh, I didn't realize he was part of that. Oh, yeah, I see that right there, Mozaffarian. Yep. That's interesting. Yeah.
He is a cardiologist. So yeah, I think
what do we do about
that's
that lack of training?
Well, again, to Brian's point, people need to realize that they can't rely on their doctor. And often when I am talking, not often anymore, but at the beginning, people would say, well, you're not a doctor. And I would say, so what? They don't know anything. And all the doctors I know, including the one on this podcast, who have an interest in nutrition, got it outside of medical school. They got it because of typically personal health meetings or personal health issues, or, in some cases, doctors like Dr. Westman or Dr. Eads, who you mentioned in your book. It's incredibly comprehensive in that way, by the way. Well done. You talk to all the right people. We're successful at actually treating this stuff, right, with their patients. Successful, unlike the majority of doctors who are not successful in treating this. And I think getting people to realize that, no, your doctor or your nutritionist is not the person you should be going to for your health advice is something that's necessary, but it's also very difficult to get people to understand. I mean, we learned over the last 2 years, or the last couple of years now, that a lot of unscientific treatments will get taken up very quickly by the medical profession.
Yeah.
And it's a problem.
Yeah, there's a silver lining in the chaos of the last few years, is that people are going to think twice about a lot of things. So I think that is that's a positive that came out of the mess. We can all agree that it was such a mess. I lived it. The pandemic started 9 months into my residency. I have a lot of nurses where I've only seen their face a couple times because we're masks in the clinics and the hospitals and stuff. But when I changed my narrative and I started seed pilling, talking about seed oils to my patients as the main intervention that I want to discuss with them, a lot of people are only one step away from understanding that part of the narrative. When I bring it up to them, they would say, "Oh, I only use butter and olive oil." They don't realize that most of their olive oils are fake, right?
Yeah.
But the incoherent part is that if you tried to get into the weeds with them, and I didn't talk about saturated fat, but chances are a lot of them might go, "Yeah, saturated fat's bad," right? They would get lost. So I think that we're actually in an incoherent point in time in terms of people have conflicting views. Just because the sound bites that they have at ready, might not, or contradict each other, right? Or it might not align. And even in what we were talking about earlier with Tucker, we know cardiologists that are carnivores, but does that mean they're going to give a speech at the American College of Cardiology about it? No, they're probably going to be shot.
Right.
So that is a time, and this being the social media age, luckily people are doing their own research, which is good in some ways and it's bad in other ways and in some things, but it's good for nutrition. And I think that we have fertile ground for the hearts and minds, and it's a good time to be in this business of talking about things.
Yeah, a lot of people, not everybody obviously, are very much more skeptical after the last couple of years.
Yeah. But when people say to me, okay, so if I can't trust a doctor or a nutritionist, or, if what I've been reading about and told about for the past 2 decades is wrong, where should I go for my information? The best I can think of to tell them is, well, go to all these people at the back of my book because I trust them and they are trustworthy and they are not paid for by industry, and they have independent research points of view and research-based points of view. So in a way, for people to make their way through the information, which is just all over the place on social media, they need some guidance as to who to follow, because you can find some very, very bad guidance on social media as well. And people generally do. And they'll wave the article in your face, say, "See, it says here that vegetable oils are better for me than saturated fats," or whatever the case may be. Or, "I don't really need B12 because the cattle only get it because we feed it to them in supplements anyway." So everything is available on the internet. So what do you tell people when they say, "Well, where am I going to get my information?" Do you just direct them to certain people, certain websites, or do you give them some criteria for evaluating that information?
I start off with the evolutionary ancestral criteria, and I say, look at what your great grandparents were eating, right? Because typically, when I say that to people, most people say, "Oh yeah, well, they were, vigorous and robust into their 80s or whatever, and they weren't overweight because nobody was back then." And what were they eating? Because the problem is these novel foods for the most part. Now, unfortunately, in the United States, or in the UK, we're at a point where you have to go pretty far back. I mean, my grandfather was born in 1899, but, not everybody can say that. When I was talking to an Indian diabetic group, that was my message. I was like, you guys have an ancient culture. What were you eating? You weren't eating you ditched ghee in this generation or maybe the previous generation, and switched to seed oils, and now you've all gotten sick. Maybe you should go back to what your grandmother was doing. And generally they say people are incredibly receptive to that, message. I mean, your grandmother, you may have a wonderful doctor, but your grandmother cares more about you than your doctor does. Guaranteed.
Yeah.
And also, I like to say that, you know, most of the time doctors are lifeguards, not swim coaches.
Right.
And
great way to put it.
Yeah, that is good.
Yeah, I think I got that from Rob Wolf years ago, or maybe he got it from someone, not sure, but you know, that I've come back to that time and time again. And it can be respectful too, because instead of saying, oh, we don't know anything, or they don't know anything.
Yeah.
You could say, you know, we have different roles to play, right? And we're held back by guidelines, but you know, if you worried about a chest pain or a shortness of air or a weird growth on your leg, go and see your general
by
practitioner.
all means, see the doctor, not your grandma.
Yeah.
If you have chest pain, you might want to call 911, but it depends on the context. But so there's definitely a generational difference too. Some people, you know, whatever the doctor told them, other people go, I'm not talking to my doctor about nutrition. What are you kidding? You know, and it's because of these conversations that people have had over decades. So definitely a culture shift there.
Yeah. Well, those are two really good. I'm going to steal both of those lines.
Please do.
People ask me. Yeah, definitely.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
So Jayne, what would your elevator pitch be for the message of your book? Just imagine yourself in a lobby somewhere and you have, you know, a minute or two to tell someone in a friendly way that they would be able to, you know, in turn tell their friends and family.
Yeah. And you would have thought, wouldn't you, that I would have had one of these all ready to go? Wouldn't you? Because
that's the magic of the elevator pitch, is that you need to be able to let it.
I know. But what I have found, what's interesting, is that I need a different elevator pitch for each media outlet that I go on. So there's a different angle that I'm having to play.
Yeah.
Depending, and they want to know different things. So there isn't just a one size fits all elevator pitch. But
smart. Smart.
Yeah. But generally, when people say, well, what is your book about? I refer to the title in the sense of saying, contrary to what you've been told or what you might have read, eating a plants-only diet is not going to make you healthier, and it's not going to save the planet. To which most people go, what, are you kidding me? That's crazy. We hear that every day. So that opens the door. And then usually what I have to then say, because people will then say, well, how can that possibly be the case when everybody else says something different? Everybody else says that it is the solution, right? So then you have to just hint at the idea that the reason everybody says so is that there's a whole constellation of people and organizations who have an interest in promoting that message.
Right.
And they have done such a good job that we think it's a scientific consensus when it actually isn't. And usually that's all you have time to say at a dinner party or in the elevator, right? And then sometimes people will ask me to expand a little bit. And I have to say, I never go with the Seventh-day Adventists, because
no, I think that's right.
Even though it's the origin of the whole thing,
it's interesting.
And it's interesting. It's kind of unbelievable to people. And I think they need to maybe hear that bit at the end.
And it can sound conspiratorial or against a religion. And you know, these conversations we're having here, more long form, we're interested in all the details. You know, this isn't an elevator pitch, right?
No.
You know, one thing that I like to put in any kind of elevator pitch that I would put in is some extra friendliness to it. You know, we've been wrong about cholesterol, and that's really interesting. And you know, we only discovered what omega-6 was in the 1930s, you know, and it had already been in the food, in the cottonseed oil, right? And you know, these kind of playing both sides in an honest way
Yeah.
ingratiates yourself to people too. And
Yeah.
and it can hook people, and be like, we were wrong about a lot of things, but there's so much momentum already there.
Yeah.
And that's one of the bits of spice that I like to put in.
Well, that's another good tip that I'm going to steal, which is that little friendly uplift at the beginning of the pitch. Say, yeah, we, contrary to what we've been told, and we have been all told, we've been led down this path.
Yeah.
It's not going to make you healthier, and it's not going to save the planet. And it's a matter of just gently leading people into the story, because the people who are actually reading the book, funny enough, they're the ones that probably know most of the story anyway, because they're really interested in it.
Yeah.
I have to find a way of luring the more innocent people into reading the book.
I don't know if you realize this, but when you use the word contrary, there was something poetic about that with the title too. I really like that.
You're right. Well, the word con.
Yeah.
No, I didn't do it on purpose, but I have become really so conscious of how many words have the word con as a root word.
Yeah.
And actually and they all controversy, consensus.
Yes.
The actual word con itself, the conman element, interpretation of the word, which, by the way, was part of the legal process. We had to alter that slightly.
Oh, I'm sure the lawyers love that. Was there a different title
and
originally?
Abrupt word? Yeah.
So my interpretation became less about a con, as in people stealing your money and pulling strings and doing things intentionally, and more about the conditioning of thought. And in fact, that in the end, that does reflect reality a bit more, because it is a slow, steady conditioning of our thought processes towards the consensus through a multiplicity of avenues and with a multiplicity of forces sort of playing that role. It's not one person, one organization, and it's not one dimensional. It's very complex.
And you also do, Leah Keith's book was very compelling, but it was also very strident. And, obviously she was very emotional about what had happened to her, whereas this is a much more kind of objective overview, which I think will appeal to hopefully a wider audience. It's
interesting though, because I love that book so much. Vegetarian Myth.
It's an amazing book.
It's an awesome book. And I found her way of writing was actually really generous and really kind. And maybe I need to go back and read it. I didn't see the stridency. But certainly one of the things I tried to do in my 4th, 5th, and 6th drafts of this book was to take stridency out of it. And to make it a little bit more, and also to accept that, some of these people who are promoting these alternative points of view and promoting plant-based diets with such vehemence, they actually believe that what they're doing is right. There are some people that are doing
most of them do. Yeah.
Some organizations are cynical, but there are lots of other people who are really doing it with a very genuine belief that this is the right way to do things. So we have to be a little bit gentle and respectful of that, don't we?
I don't know about that.
You don't think so?
I don't. Look, I've had a lot of experience with people advocating this way of eating. I had an enormous amount of respect for my Jayne colleague, and I don't agree with, I don't agree with it. I didn't become a Jayne as a result of my conversations with him, but I learned to respect it. That sort of person I respect, because he was honest about it. And he could explain that, yes, there are health problems. This is why we think it's an acceptable sacrifice. That's fine. I don't have any issue with anybody who does that. But people who go out, as we've discussed, and try and convince children to eat in a way that's going to permanently damage their health, I don't care what your intentions are. That is just bad behavior. And I don't think those people deserve any respect or deference.
Well, there you go. You said it.
So, and unfortunately, most of the folks that you meet online advocating this sort of message are not like my Jayne colleague.
No, there's very little honesty. But what I guess I'm getting at is even the people who make the vile comments online and who lash out and who tell lies, absolutely no respect for that whatsoever. But there's certain comments that come from people, and you can sense, I can almost hear the panic in their commentary. It's oh my goodness, you're showing me something that completely goes against everything I've been led to believe. I thought all the science was on my side. How can you possibly be telling me this? This is scary. Do you know what I mean by those kind of comments? And you can hear that uncertainty.
I went through that myself when I fixed my own diet. I remember the panic attack. I'm, kind of off topic, severely gluten intolerant. And I remember the panic attack I had when I realized I was never going to be able to eat wheat again. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to starve to death. What am I going to eat? Right. I get that. It's traumatic.
Yeah. So unfortunately, there's no cure for that except more information. Just keep pushing the information out.
Right.
It's hopeful that people even had that reaction, because most people don't make decisions based off of a careful analysis of data. It's just a fact. Most people don't do that. So if you get that kind of reaction of people going, wait, this is new information, hallelujah. That's wonderful that that's happening with people.
Yeah.
Okay, well I think that's
surely.
Yeah, I think that's probably an excellent note to wind up on. Jayne, any closing comments you'd like to make?
Just, I'd like to say that I am really grateful for the American podcast community for embracing this message and the kind of the power of the book and the value in the book and trying to get the word out, because the American podcast community has been by and large much braver than the UK based community. And there has been much more of a reaction here amongst prominent podcasters who won't be named, but saying, no, thanks, I can't deal with that topic. It might offend some people.
In the UK.
And I have found that that's also true of some of the mainstream media. And then the bravery of other aspects of the mainstream media here has also surprised me. So I think you find a willingness to discuss and bravery in some surprising places. But I think that the American community seems to be more willing to discuss this and put it on the table and take a few risks. So I found that really interesting, and thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure. And tell us, your website for the book is thegreatplantbasedcon.com. How else can folks find out? Obviously, they can go buy a copy of your book, which is the recommended avenue. How else can people find out more about the book and your other work?
Well, they can go to JayneReesBuxton.com, so that all website addresses lead to the same place. And I should clarify about the book, because there's been some confusion in America, because at the moment, only the Kindle version and the Audible version is available from Amazon.com. But the hard copy will be available in 6 months' time. And that is one of the vagaries of intercontinental publishing, which is very frustrating.
Wow.
But if people really do want the hard copy now, they can order it from amazon.co.uk and pay for postage. So it's a little bit of a sacrifice, but they can get it. And the reason I say that is because there's been some frustration expressed on Twitter about not being able to get the book.
I guess that's a good sign. Did you read the Audible version?
Did I read the Audible? No, I didn't. No, it was an actress who sounds a bit like me, I think. But I decided to let a professional do it because it's so hard reading a book that's 500 pages.
Some authors do, and I think
Yeah,
in some cases it can be really beneficial. But yeah, it's certainly not easy to do that.
Yeah, but we had to redo some of it because there's so many acronyms in the book that the reader did not know how to pronounce. So we had a bit of a session on that, but then one got left out, and it was, the measure for methane is GWP 100 or GWP star. And the GWP star got left out of the audible version, so we had to re-record that. So there are the perils of having somebody read it who doesn't quite know what the content is, that's for sure.
Oh dear, that sounds like a bit of a chore. Well,
yeah.
It's been wonderful talking to you, Jayne. I wish you all the success with this book. It's certainly a message that needs to be out there and needs to counter a lot of the bad information that's flying around on the topics of diet and health. And I think you do a wonderful job of correcting that piece of it and explaining exactly where this message is coming from and why it's not something that we should be relying on. Bravo.
Thank you. And I'd like to stay in touch if we can think of some great ideas for getting this movement going, Brian. This counter movement, if we can unify some of the bodies that are working towards that, it would be great.
Absolutely.